Okay. All right. Well, thanks for joining us to discuss goal 16, 17, and 18 in Clatsop County. We are we have about 2 hours tonight. We're gonna start like we have in the last meetings with some discussion that's oriented to the estuaries and shorelands surrounding them, and then have some discussion around goal 18 and shorelands that are amongst the beach and dune environment and the outer coast. And we'll be trying to wrap up by 5 p.m. So again, I'm Garrett Phillips with Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, and we're getting assistance on the project from Herrera Environmental Consultants. We're currently in a phase of the project where we're developing and finalizing some draft policies and maps. And we do have a hard deadline to finish our part of the project by January 14th. And then there'll be additional public meetings going into 2025 where there can be some more discussion on what's being proposed. So we'll have one more technical advisory committee meeting in December. And if we need to have another one in January to sort of report out on what we did since December, Crest is available to do that as well. And then we'll have an in-person public meeting and a virtual public meeting in December as well. So some focus areas for goal 16 and 17 are to make some policy recommendations that respond to climate change impacts in Clatsop County's current goal 16 and 17 policies. So the idea is that in 2025, Clatsop County would adopt some new policies that respond to climate change impacts. And also to make some longer term recommendations for updating estuary management plans that can be more comprehensive in nature and that would then thereafter be also adopted by cities and the county after what would presumably be a multi-year process based on how long it's taken to update estuary management plans recently in other jurisdictions. But the idea is that we have an opportunity to scope or inform the scope of a project like that and identify some prominent issues that we need to make sure get the attention they deserve there. And then for goal 18, also for 2025, updating some policies in response to climate change and particularly sea level rise impacts that are forecasted, developing policies around non-structural erosion control, cable landings, armoring for public roads, and finally incorporating some public access policies that the county has already developed through a public process. So again, another TAC meeting in December to review draft policies and maps with y'all, and we'll be sending out material for you to review before then, and we're looking forward to doing that. So to start with goal 16 and related goal 17 areas, want to have a discussion about a few topics in particular. One is incorporating or responding to FEMA's requirements to incorporate the Endangered Species Act into flood hazard management recommendations, and whether or not there's opportunities to, whether or not there's consistency issues or opportunities to address the requirements of both in a more unified way or reduce redundancies. also want to talk about a few different issues related to Goal 16 impact assessments, and also get some guidance and input from y'all on updating the Columbia River Estuary Dredge Material Management Plan. It was last updated in 2005. So I guess just to get started with Pick'em and Goal 16 and 17, some of you probably know a lot more about this than others, but basically FEMA is requiring local governments in Oregon throughout most of the state to incorporate some standards that implement the Endangered Species Act whenever a floodplain development permit is required. And there are many situations where a floodplain development permit is required, and a development or action is also subject to the standards of Goal 16 and or Goal 17. So the PICM, as it's called, the pre-implementation compliance measures, are specifically aiming at protecting endangered species habitat, particularly habitat for fish, endangered fish, and it employs mitigation sequencing, so requirements to avoid impacts and then minimize and then mitigate for impacts to fish habitat. And there's some specific standards that are supposed to be used for floodplain development permits. Goal 16 includes some overlapping requirements, such as describing existing endangered fish habitat in an impact assessment, describing potential impacts to it, describing ways that impacts could be avoided and minimized in no particular order. And ultimately, there are compensatory mitigation requirements implemented by DSL for wetland fills as well, but not compensatory mitigation for sort of all impact pathways necessarily. Goal 17 similarly has some protections for endangered species habitat, for example, setbacks, riparian setbacks where development is prohibited. So in a prior meeting, the Technical Advisory Committee expressed some interest in finding ways to allow applicants to satisfy the requirements of one of these systems with requirements that they already have to satisfy from the other. So FEMA is being relatively specific about the ways that they want endangered fish habitat to be protected, and they've identified trees in the floodplain and occupy space, like volume of floodplain that's occupiable by fish, and impervious surfaces as sort of three proxies for all the potential values of fish habitat and the ways that it could be impacted. And there's some specific standards that do not appear to be very flexible. So we've identified for now one potential way to address redundancy with Goal 16 at least, and that would be simply to say that if an applicant is obtaining a floodplain development permit that's subject to PICM, then for all the project components that have to address those FEMA PICM requirements, they don't also then have to go and describe impacts to fish habitat and describe how they're going to avoid and minimize impacts to fish habitat. And then in terms of compensatory mitigation, I think that's, because it's implemented, at least compensatory mitigation for fill implemented by DSL, that's probably a longer term and bigger picture coordination question to consider how DSL's requirements would mesh with Pick'em, but it could at least lessen by a little bit the amount of information that an applicant has to write and describe in an impact assessment, and the amount of information that local governments have to review. And then in terms of other habitat protections, like riparian development setbacks under Goal 17, we're also thinking that that demonstrating that Pick'em that satisfying the Pick'em requirements would also satisfy Goal 17 requirements to protect habitat would require a bit more justification and more extensive research findings, coordination with stakeholders, but that is an opportunity for an update to the estuary management plans to further integrate Pick'em with Goal 17 requirements. And I think there'd be probably other opportunities as well, and especially considering that flood hazard management ordinances throughout most of Oregon not only have to be updated now to implement the pre-implementation compliance measures, but will likely have to be updated again after that in a few years when FEMA completes their environmental impact assessment and final recommendations for implementing the National Marine Fisheries Services BiOp. I'm sorry, that's a mouthful, but it's just to say that there's some requirements that local governments have to do now for Pick'em, and they're going to change a little bit in the coming years. And that basically means that when an estuary management plan is done, hopefully in a few years, that would be a time to invest more resources in integrating these two systems. So just wanted to pause here for a minute and see if anyone has issues with trying to lower the information requirements and impact assessments so that it's not redundant with Pick'em, or if anyone has other ideas on how the two regulatory systems could conceivably be integrated more, sort of topics for an estuary management plan to dive into more detail on. So we're taking a look at the chat and waiting for raised hands, or if you want to speak up, you can. Any thoughts for now?
My initial thought is that that sounds like a really good idea.
Okay. Let's see. Nothing in the chat. Okay. Well, if anything else comes to mind on this, y'all are welcome to reach out outside of the meeting or just speak up as the meeting goes on.
What what are the questions? I guess that's the question I have.
Oh, so the question is, the questions that we have for you right now are,
oh yeah, or the duplicating questions. That's all.
sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Oh, I was saying what I'm more interested to know what the actual questions that are being duplicated are. Just what they, yeah. If there's, I was not knowing what the questions are. I'm not sure what, yeah, what the objective of those questions are.
Okay. Yeah, so for Pick'em and integrating the Endangered Species Act, FEMA has basically develop standards that local governments have to implement that will make it so that you are not supposed to have a net loss of pervious surface within the floodplain, a net loss of trees and their canopy within the floodplain, and and you're not supposed to have a net loss of of space or volume, I should say, occupiable by fish during a flood. And those are like proxies for impacts to endangered fish habitat. And they say if you don't have a net loss of any of those things, then you're not jeopardizing endangered fish.
Gotcha.
And yeah, go ahead.
Is there any question about net gain, or something that could be added in there in terms of, we're always looking for ways to get more riparian plantings done, more large wood into the system. Yeah, I don't know if there would be an opportunity to have a net gain in conjunction, or almost maybe some mitigation style. Anyway, just a thought. I don't want to get too off topic.
So in terms of implementing, yeah, no, this is great. In terms of implementing the pre-implementation compliance measures for FEMA, their goal is not to create a net gain in habitat quality. Their compensatory mitigation system does require, for example, like 2-to-1, or in some cases 3-to-1 mitigation ratios, depending on how you're mitigating for each of those three impacts. But it's all just to achieve like no jeopardy to endangered fish. And then for goal 17, my understanding is there's also not goal 16 and 17, there's also not a requirement to actually enhance or improve on a net basis fish habitat over time. Or there's not a requirement for applicants to demonstrate that they're not only not impacting fish habitat, but that they're improving it. That's also not a requirement of goal 16 and 17. But I think your comment speaks to sort of to me, it speaks also to, like, at least with Pick'em, the lack of nuance, and they've created a fairly uniform and narrow system. Again, these sort of three characteristics that are supposed to represent all kinds of habitat impacts. And then for goal 17, I think that's something for us to look at is, without making things overly complicated, is there flexibility for applicants to improve habitat characteristics where, the unique conditions on their site provide an opportunity to do that, that's not too uniform. But it is hard to imagine the county sort of fundamentally going beyond goal 16 and 17 minimum standards to say that we are going to improve fish habitat, for any given application that comes in. Annie, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I regrettably haven't been diving into this as much as I maybe should have, but from what it seems like this process and this requirement, the Pick'em compliance, is more stringent or protective of habitat than goal 16 and goal 17, right? Is that, or is it more nuanced than that?
Yeah, I would say not necessarily. Like Pick'em doesn't include any sort of minimum development setback from a stream bank. So like, that's not more stringent. Like everything is, all of those three impacts can be mitigated theoretically. with Pickham.
Yeah.
And then there's other kinds of impacts that to fish, endangered fish habitat, that I don't think are really captured by the 3 proxy characteristics: trees, occupiable floodplain volume, and impervious surfaces. Like pollution runoff, pollution that's in stormwater runoff, for example, that should be addressed. There is because of the lack of nuance, I could see goal 16 and 17 protections in some cases, carrying some of the load of protecting fish habitat despite Pickham. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then I totally agree that it is really important to prioritize making sure that there's, some kind of synergy or figuring out how best to fit these Pickham compliance measures with goal 16 and 17 requirements. I think this is a really great opportunity that you identified. And then the other question I have is, I know this applies to developments in the floodplain, but what about restoration projects?
Yeah, so there are a list of activities that are exempt from floodplain management, that are exempt from the Pickham standards. And I would have to look to see if restoration projects are. I mean, I think I'm trying to imagine a situation where that would come into play. But
Jared,
yeah,
I mean,
go ahead.
you and I were on the same meeting earlier today, and there was a question about, and I know that was focused only on the permit by permit basis, but FEMA had stated that that removing invasive trees out of the floodplain was not immediately permitted, but it was resolved if you replaced them with native trees. But there was a little bit of discussion, I think, about restoration, but it's not straightforward, I guess, is what I'm understanding.
Yeah, I think it's not. Brett raises a point. It's not straightforward, and I would say that it's also evolving, and will continue to evolve for a few years as FEMA sees how local governments are implementing Pickham and provides feedback on it, and until the final requirements of National Marine Fisheries Service's biological opinion are implemented through FEMA's EIS. So there's going to be changes in the coming years, and it feels like FEMA doesn't know what their requirements are, beyond being able to say what they've written. But then they do often have trouble sort of responding to questions about scenarios and what would happen in one situation or another situation. So I think it speaks to not trying to integrate, not doing too much to try to integrate them quite yet, but there does seem to be perhaps an opportunity, sort of a minor opportunity through the impact assessment requirements to give applicants a little bit of a break there.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if there was some sort of incentive even around getting, more woody stems per acre, potentially more to deal with some of those other things like pollution and runoff and, maybe ways to, because when development happens, that's going to lead to more of that. So yeah, I'd just be interested to see some sort of way in which that could be incentivized through the process or other aspects. If one thing is done to help the fish habitat due to another thing that's not going to help it, some sort of way to plug into the local watershed council or other service providers that could help with that. So.
Okay. Thanks for that input. Yeah, I mean, I think it points to, it raises another potential, you know, habitat value that's not really addressed by Pickham, which is like non-tree riparian vegetation, which is, you know, it's kind of ignored in the Pickham regulatory system, but it's obviously important. I want to make sure we have time to move on to some other topics, but Annie?
Yeah, really quick. I just had the idea that I mean, really, I really like the incentive point that Graham raised, and maybe thinking about some kind of incentive more broadly for implementing any kind of like nature-based solution in design could be really nice to see.
Okay. Interesting. We'll take a look at introducing a couple concepts that could at least be addressed perhaps in a more comprehensive way through the estuary management plan update. Um, so thanks for your input on that. Was anyone else waiting to speak up about this before we move on? Okay. All right, so some other impact assessment related topics here. Just as a reminder, when there's work that's proposed in or over water in the estuaries, impact assessments are required by Goal 16. And impact assessments are supposed to describe the work that's going to occur, how it could, it's supposed to describe the resources that could be affected, how those effects would occur, and how the impacts can be avoided and minimized. And one issue we've heard from some stakeholders is that, well, I guess it's two sort of interrelated issues, is one that the impact assessments can be somewhat burdensome for applicants, a little bit in terms of having to prepare them, but more in terms of the additional time that it takes and that it adds to their overall project permitting timelines. And then we have heard from some local government staff when we were speaking with cities that some of the standards in Goal 16, particularly around dredge material management, are challenging to follow within their own ordinances. These are based on the Columbia River Estuary Management Plan and Columbia River Estuary Dredge Material Management Plan. There's seemingly conflicting standards that could be interpreted different ways. And so we were looking at opportunities for potentially lowering the burden on applicants and also making it easier for local governments to implement Goal 16 standards. And so one of the thoughts we wanted to run by you is that in the next estuary management plan update, you think it would be worthwhile to try to describe the impacts of some activities up front in the estuary management plan with sufficient detail that it could relieve applicants of having to complete impact assessments for individual projects. Goal 16 seems to at least conceptually allow for this, but we're not sure if it's been done and is actually practical. And so we want to hear from any of you, DLCD staff, if this has come up elsewhere, we want to hear from you about it. But a couple of potential activities are at least like local dredging projects proposed by ports. And in the Columbia River Estuary Management Plan update, if there's any dike improvements that are identified as necessary to respond to climate change, if those also could potentially be addressed in the actual estuary plan update instead of requiring impact assessments, for each action as time goes on thereafter. So some potential downsides of doing this are that if the estuary management plan didn't fully describe the potential impacts and how they were avoided or minimized, project proponents would still have to do an impact assessment later anyway. So there's some extra potential for, wasting effort in the estuary management plan update, or letting people down, or not managing expectations. But yeah, we wanted to get your input on this idea. The goal is to find ways to reduce the amount of impact assessments that have to be done, the amount of local government staff time, applicant time and expense, without compromising any estuary values while doing that. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think on one level, the fact that we have the different zoning in the estuary to some extent will limit what resources are even subject to potential impact. So, for instance, if you're trying to do a dredging project in a development area, you're already in a place where the impacts are limited in a certain way. And so there's maybe something to that. But I think there could be some site specific questions of, well, the effects depend on how well you know what's there. And so are you signing yourself up during the EMP update to have an inventory of sufficient quality to be able to do that front loaded work? And what are you really signing yourself up for? Would be a question that I would have. Yeah. But on the other hand, you may be able to take kind of a project design envelope approach to say, if you're doing a dredge disposal project, for example, and you do thin layer placement, or if you don't exceed certain thresholds or engage in certain activities, then you fall within this threshold where we've already looked at the impacts and you're okay. But if you're doing something that is outside of that envelope, then you're kicked into an individual. That there may be some way there.
Sure. So for some locations or kinds of locations, like places designated development, and yes, you would have to try to satisfy goal 16, describe sort of some project parameters in order to describe what kinds of impacts would occur. Perhaps this could work. Anybody else?
Hey, Garrett, it's Meg. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm driving, so sorry about that. But I wanted to add that, and Annie can probably say about this as well, since she participated in the Quinn Bay Estuary Management Plan update process, but we did work with the Port of Newport on some activities to do just what you're saying, for like really discrete activities where we describe the impacts and how impacts would be avoided or minimized with these few activities, and that they were then adopted as outright permitted uses only in aquatic development zones. So it was like replacing existing pile, doing underwater welding, doing wraps and grouting and that kind of stuff on pile. So it was like a really limited set of activities that the port does very regularly in aquatic development areas that would streamline their permitting processes. And I would point out, which I think you may have mentioned this too, but like a lot of these, if you were to go this route, that this like getting more streamlined review at the local level doesn't mean that they get out of review at any other level. So there's still opportunity for that. And it would just be helpful at the local level with burden. So I do think there is a possibility of this under goal 16. And I do think that there would be some benefit with habitat restoration projects, like coming up with a set of activities so that impact assessments could be avoided or much more streamlined for like a set of activities that are commonplace for habitat restoration activities. depending on where they were occurring. Like maybe it makes more sense in conservation zones to do that approach, but I do think that could be a beneficial use of kind of coming up with like a set of common activities that where the impacts could be addressed at the comprehensive plan level.
Okay, yeah, some parts of restoration projects, pile replacements, definitely comes to mind in terms of like when I've reviewed impact assessments for pile replacements. It's usually a fairly like common set of best practices that people are following, and it can feel like the impact assessment is a bit much for each of those. When you were working on Yaquina Bay's estuary management plan, did you discuss doing this with any dredge material disposal, and you decided that that would not be appropriate?
It was not discussed.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting idea, but we didn't go down that road. So I don't really have any other nuggets of information on that, but we'd be certainly, interested in that conversation and helping.
Okay. Annie?
Yeah, I also want to add that something that was novel about the Yaquina Bay update is that there were climate vulnerability impact assessments that were also included. Which I guess in theory, if the problem is, that it creates a lot more time for applicants to go through that process, they would add more time. But I also think it's really critical to be thinking about how projects might be impacted over time from various climate stressors. So I wasn't sure, is that something that you're also thinking about in this framework of impact assessments, is like how to incorporate climate change at all?
Yeah, so impact assessments are would be the main avenue through which we can start to incorporate climate change in the 2025 update. And I wasn't planning on having more discussion on that topic in particular today, because we had touched on it in one or two of the last, I think at least the last meeting, we discussed it to some extent. So yes, the kinds of changes that we're going to be proposing for impact assessments will both represent more requirements, and we're trying to find ways to imagine lessening the burden in other ways as well. So yeah, Annie?
Thank you. I also want to add, I think that totally makes sense in terms of streamlining and lessening the burden for things like restoration and for some of the discrete activities that Meg described. I think dredging, that would make us really uncomfortable, just because dredging is one of the more severe estuarine alterations you can do. And I think that does require more scrutiny, and impact assessments are definitely a part of that process. So I just want to add that 2 cents.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, in the same vein, there's information that's described in impact assessments that is oftentimes repeated in state and federal permit applications, particularly for fill. And so we were thinking that one potential way to give applicants a chance to shorten the amount of time they have to spend writing impact assessments would be to specify that they can refer to those permits and not repeat all of that information in an impact assessment to the extent that it's applicable. And we wanted to get your input on this sort of simple concept, and if you think this could go wrong in some ways, or if you have any thoughts on other places that have done it, welcome your input on that. So again, this is the kind of overlapping information that's required from a DSL fill permit and an impact assessment is like listing all of the species that aquatic species that could be impacted, describing fill and removal volumes, describing the methods that will be used for replacing piles or disposing of dredge material, and the narratives typically go to several or more pages and are largely not completely, but there's often a lot of redundant information. Any thoughts on this concept?
I would say that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. I think it's conceivably allowed already. It's just that you know, a local government planner might say no, like we have to have an impact, something called an impact assessment, and it's, you know, the code says you have to include all of these things in it. But just being able to specify that the information can be referred to in other permit applications. Sorry to interrupt. Laurel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you just want to make sure that it's not going to be too cumbersome for whoever is reviewing the permit application to then have to go through whatever other thing they're referring to and pull out whatever the person is referring to in the other materials. I could just see it being potentially difficult to go back and forth and like crosswalk it. So just
Yeah,
not something that
that's a good thought.
I would be involved in at all. I'm just putting it out there as a thought to consider.
Yeah, I don't know if
For-
any planners or applicant or sort of typical applicants are in the meeting, but you know, like in my experience reviewing impact assessments, it's common for us to get the fill removal permit as well. And then you know, I would consider it a responsibility to thoroughly review both and identify any ways that they're not consistent with each other. And so that sort of back and forth feels like it ends up happening anyway. And it could simplify it to not have to read as much, very similar, but potentially like different, you know, trying to pick out, oh, is this the same in both documents? What changed? Stuff like that. But is anyone else who's been a part of preparing or reviewing an impact assessment want to weigh in on that idea?
Hey, Garrett, it's Meg. I think in my experience, it's been common for like what's required in the DSL permit to be like referred to in impact assessments at the local level. I think one thing that could be a challenge is like the timing of things, because presumably the local permit should be the first stop, because that's about like where something can happen. And then a DSL permit would be sought after that. I mean, that actually doesn't really happen very often in real life, where like the permits might be happening simultaneously and maybe the DSL permit is even gotten first. And I think that's a problem because like it's possible that a DSL project could like say yes to something that's actually fundamentally not allowed in a certain area in the local plan. And they should be connected, but sometimes and like the Lux would eventually stop that from happening anyway. But like, I just think that like there is a potential issue with the timing because like the local permit should be done first before the DSL
Right.
permit.
Right. Yeah, like okay, that makes sense. That's a good thing for us to look out for and make sure that we're not being too sweeping in what we recommend here.
It could be like, you know, the other documentation or something can be relied upon for informing the impact assessment, something like that allows for it, but it's not the only option.
Sure. I saw Kevin, you had your hand raised, and Annie again after Kevin.
Yeah, I guess I was just gonna add on to kind of what Meg was saying though, is that it's something that I really like that idea, but one of the things that can happen is, you know, if it's all on the local side, then sometimes it puts pressure on the other regulatory agencies because like, well, we already have our local approval, so therefore you have to tell me yes and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure how you get past that. I guess I wanted to just point that out as more of a, if you front load it on the local level, make sure it's tied into whatever the regulatory programs are on the other side. Because as Meg was saying, they do sometimes go on at the same time. Other times applicants will come in and have completely gone through the local process. And then it's like, well, they said yes, so why don't you? And then it's either start back through the local process to meet the other laws, or, you know, there's just kind of a lot of resistance and pushback. So just, again, more of a, we don't want to cause more work. I think there are some valid avenues moving forward, and generally I like the idea. I just wanted to bring that up as kind of something I've seen in the past.
Okay. All right. Annie, is there something else you wanted to say about this? And then I think we're gonna try to move on after that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I guess like if this were something to pursue, I think there needs to be some kind of analysis about or looking at the different types of state and federal permits and what would be required for their impact assessments, and then matching that at the local level so that it's like uniform. And as long as it's as stringent as, you know, what's going to be required for DSL removal fill and other requirements, then it should be okay at the local level just to check it off. But the timing situations and everything, everyone raised some really good points. So I don't know.
All right. That makes sense. Sort of a more systematic crosswalk of what we're really saying someone could get out of having to do in their local impact assessment, and sort of clearly identifying where that information is expected to be found in a different permit process. All right, we're going to move on to an issue that was raised by a stakeholder about in the last meeting, I think, sort of a concept that came up, or perhaps it was in a meeting outside of the technical advisory committee. But there's this idea that this concept of mitigation sequencing for impacts to, you know, any number of natural resources, oftentimes in terms of impacts to wetlands and fish habitat. But the idea is in the mitigation sequence is that an applicant first demonstrates how they're going to avoid impacts. Once they've, you know, considered and described that in an application, and they've identified what impacts can't be avoided, they then describe how they're going to minimize those impacts that can't be avoided. For those impacts, then, you know, to the extent they can be minimized, that's great. But then afterwards, compensatory mitigation is done. So we had a comment that that the counties and the respective other local governments, the cities, and even State Goal 16 doesn't seem to clearly require like a mitigation sequence per se. Goal 16 requires that applicants describe how impacts could be avoided and minimized. And then there's a compensatory mitigation requirement for fill. The comment was, can we require something more like an actual mitigation sequence for estuarine impacts, habitat and wetland impacts through the counties and other local governments' Goal 16 elements. And so we wanted to sort of just get this idea out with everybody, and just see what you all thought of it in terms of how it would work with state goal 16. And wanting to avoid redundancy with DSL's fill compensatory mitigation requirements. And any thoughts you had about moving towards more of a mitigation sequence kind of requirement in estuaries? Jeff?
Yeah, what would be your decision criteria or thresholds for when you can go from one rung of the ladder to the next? Is it avoid to the extent practical or practicable? Those have different meanings related to what extent you are incorporating cost concerns and, all of that.
Good question. That would be a topic that would have to be addressed, absolutely. Important differences that would come with like pretty nuanced language.
So to me, this is one area where having this kind of mitigation sequence is actually, it seems more aligned with DSL's process for removal fill, for instance. And so this is one opportunity to maybe bring more alignment between different regulations. So in that way, referring to what DSL requires for the decision threshold might be one way to review that criteria and match it and
Okay.
redundancy.
All right. Kevin?
Well, not estuary related. I'm just thinking, having this framework built in, I think could align across any of these. I mean, that's effectively the same sequencing that we use on the ocean shore, and it's going to be the same thing in stream. So it's kind of that. It's nice to have that common language, that at least when applicants, no matter who an applicant's talking to, they're hearing that same kind of messaging of, you don't just come in and ask for what you want. You actually have to go through. And that kind of goes back to what the statement I had said before, where we'll sometimes get county approval for something, and it's like, well, that's not even consistent because you didn't actually do the sequencing. And so, I think that's where there is truly potentially some value. There could be some problems if, I'll say if things are adopted straight off of another agency and then the agency's rules change or things of that nature. So there'll need to be a way to make sure those are flexible over time, whether it's by reference and not by just copying and pasting or something of that nature, but just kind of to think about, because those rules, while they tend to be somewhat static, they're always changing. I look back to the time when I left DSL. I mean, the last 20 years, the rules are very similar, but there's a lot of changes since I left. I mean, it's not really the same program. So, that's just something to be aware of, that they do change pretty routinely.
Yeah. Okay. We do have one more sort of goal 16, 17 issue to discuss. So it is okay if we don't spend as much time on this idea, but any other thoughts before we move on to discussing the potential topic of or the idea of updating the dredge material management plan in the next several years? All right. Well, I'm going to go through a few slides as briefly as I can, and then have a question for you about where you think local governments in the Columbia River estuary should go with dredge material management planning. So local policies and standards in the local government's development codes on dredge material disposal are largely based on the 2002 dredge material management plan that was originally done in 1979. It's been updated twice. And the purpose of the DMMP, as the plan itself stated, was to provide policies on how and where to dispose of dredge material. It designated sites for dredge material disposal. It established policies on how additional sites could be designated. And I think this is sort of a very important distinction, that it not only conserves sites for dredge material disposal, which is required by goal 16 and 17, but making sure that you have sites set aside for disposing of dredge material so that you don't run out of them. That's sort of the goal there. But it also sets itself up as a prerequisite for making dredge material disposal allowed. So if a site's not identified in the plan, it's then it's really challenging to get approved to dispose of dredge material there, and basically requires a comprehensive plan amendment to do that. And the plan was intended to be updated every 5 years on a regular basis. And so it presumed, we'll update this plan every 5 years, and so we'll be aware of where dredge material disposal is needed. We'll have a sort of every 5 years, we'll know how much demand there is in each part of the river, and so it's okay to sort of use this as a screening tool and say, if a site isn't designated here, you're not going to be able to dispose of dredge material, because we'll update it every 5 years. And it applies to dredging by the Army Corps and other entities like the Port of Astoria and the Coast Guard, for example. So clearly, there's less resources or willingness to do plan updates than was anticipated when the plan was created. We've heard from at least the Port of Astoria that they feel like they have limited resources for managing the permit process for getting dredge material disposals permitted, and that the process is challenging. There is more robust state and federal resource protections than there were originally when the local plans were conceived of. There's more of a need now than in the past for sort of adaptive management of dredge material disposal. And for example, the Army Corps of Engineers has indicated that it's challenging to identify specific sites and then stick with those for a long period of time. And again, the DMMP and then the local regulations that are based on it are written as if the plan is being updated on a regular basis. And finally, another issue is that the scope of the DMMP does go somewhat beyond goal 16 and 17 requirements, in that it establishes itself as a prerequisite for making a disposal site allowable. So there's some issues with the dredge material management plan, aside from the fact that it's now 22 years old. But goal 16 and 17 do require that there's some kind of plan, at least to make sure that there's sites available for disposal in the future. And so local governments are supposed to collaborate to create a plan from time to time. So I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip through some of these details. So yeah, this is the requirement. Local governments and state and federal agencies have to develop comprehensive programs identifying specific sites and procedures for dredge material disposal. And the state goals establish some limitations on where disposal is allowed to occur anyway. And then areas that are necessary for dredge material disposal are essentially coastal shorelands according to Goal 17. So local governments are supposed to identify upland areas that are necessary for dredge material disposal. Those become part of Goal 17 coastal shorelands, and those places are supposed to be protected under Goal 17 for dredge material disposal. Okay, so we're thinking about those issues that I described. There's less resources to update DMMPs, amongst other issues. And there's, and so when Clatsop County and other local governments have an opportunity to update the Columbia River Estuary Management Plan, I think there's, I guess, broadly speaking and thinking as broadly as we can, there's a few different options on how they could treat the dredge material management plan. And one would be to essentially not update it and continue using the current one and just do plan amendments as needed. Another sort of middle or minimal approach would be to update the inventory of sites in the plan based on plan amendments that have occurred since 2002 and the Army Corps of Engineers' most recent plan for the Columbia River Estuary, sort of taking that as an indication of their demand of needed sites and getting some input from other dredge material disposal project proponents, like the Port of Astoria and anyone else. And at least try to update the inventory of sites that are needed and consider those in the plan. And, if you wanted to do that, you could try to do most of the things that are in the 2002 plan, like estimating a 5-year demand and match that up with 5 years of supply sites based on the volume of dredge material that needs to be disposed of. Providing updates to policies and descriptions of dredge material disposal methods, including the kinds of technology that's used by the Corps and other entities that are doing the dredging, considering updated science on impacts from dredge material disposal and describing that in the plan. And again, the status quo approach would include like reiterating this sort of preference and policy for only using sites that are designated in the plan, and requiring a plan amendment for using any other sites. So that'd be sort of like the status quo approach. And then there's other sort of emphasis areas like a DMMP. Like there's not much about it that's prescribed in Goal 16 and 17. So there's opportunities to make it something that's useful for local communities in other ways, like having extra emphasis on identifying beneficial use sites to respond to, areas of erosion, for example, like how can dredge material disposal be put to work for, local priorities, especially considering sea level rise, for example. Again, I guess the first bullet on the right-hand side of the slide, we discussed this a little bit and we already got some input from y'all on the idea of addressing impact assessment requirements for local proponents in advance through a plan, instead of requiring impact assessments for each disposal project. And then Another option would be reconsidering whether the DMMP should be used as a prerequisite for whether or not sites can be allowed for disposal, since doesn't seem to be explicitly required by goal 16 and 17. And then potentially based on what stakeholders think is like a realistic timeline for updating the DMMP, reconsidering the policies on how to designate new sites or how to make new sites allowable, so that potentially, for example, a plan amendment wouldn't be required each time a new disposal need at a reasonable site arises. So these are, I want to get your thoughts. This isn't necessarily like multiple choice, like you pick one without qualifications, but want to get your thoughts on sort of the 3 sort of conceptual approaches to updating the dredge material management plan on the left, and some of these alternative emphasis areas on the right as well. Okay. And he says yes to incorporating beneficial use as sort of an emphasis area in a plan update. Okay. And sort of spending maybe more time or resources in a plan update to identify beneficial uses. Jeff?
Yeah, this is going to be a little bit muddled as I'm just kind of thinking through it. I haven't really thought about how to redo this if we were going to do it, but and you know, Gail can smack me later if I'm being heretical here, but in the way that I've begun to understand how this all works, the dredge material management plan identifies areas that seem to be suitable. But if it identifies an area in a conservation management unit, for example, the dredge material management plan does not create that site. It still needs to be activated through a plan amendment and a goal exception to even be usable. And so we could update the dredge material management plan in the modern day and add 50 new sites in the DMMP, but none of those sites would be usable until you go through a formal plan amendment process. And so, in a way, the DMMP is a little bit of a middleman in all of this, where it's identifying things that you could do once you get around to it. And there's that table in the back that I think is really interesting, where it has little like restrictions and riders on those sites to say, if you activate this site, you will not do more than this many cubic yards in a year. And so my heresy here is, what if we just cut out the middleman and say, through the plan amendment process for goal 16 that's going on now, identify the new sites that you want to add today that'll get you through until the next time you want to do a goal 16 amendment. And that if people want to add more sites in the in-between, then they have to go through the formal process to do it. And back when the 2002 DMMP was alongside the Army Corps' DMMP, right? Well, now the Army Corps has just submitted a new 20-year DMMP where they're proposing a couple dozen new sites in Clatsop County. And Clatsop County gets to decide, of those, the ones that need plan amendment goal exception, which ones are acceptable to the county. So it's reasonable to expect that there could be new dredge material sites that are going to be added to the inventory of the county in the near future. So if just drafting along with what the Corps wants to do, there will be new sites in Clatsop County that are formalized and activated, then the question becomes, are those enough? Or does the county want to consider more sites above what the Corps is asking for that could be, future inventory? And then you can put whatever riders and restrictions you want on it. So I guess in a way, I'm just wondering what exactly is and also the site selection policies that are in the DMMP. There are site selection policies referenced in the law doc and the comp plan, but they're not actually listed in the law doc and the comp plan. And to me, that's where the actual like enforceable policies reside. And so if we just moved that site selection policies section into the, you know, the ordinance or the comp plan,
Mhm.
and then the DMMP could become forward thinking or not exist at all, and you just rely on your formal process. Because in a way,
Okay.
it's just guidance. But okay, now someone tell me why I'm wrong about all of it.
Thank you. That's a really interesting perspective and a couple of useful, practical ways to implement that idea as well.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I agree with Jeff. Like I don't actually really see a lot of benefit in the DMMP at the county level, especially because of the Army Corps' 20-year plan and the fact that they have stopped collaborating with the county. And so I think they've made it difficult to have it be a different way. And like, yeah, the DMMP, the county 2005 DMMP now is like not really that useful anymore. And I think what Jeff suggested is definitely a good approach that could be practical.
Okay. What about, do you think there's anything to be said for trying to work with non-core stakeholders or non-core, non-Army Corps dredge material disposal proponents to create something like a plan in advance to address their dredge material disposal needs for a 5 or 10 year period so that they don't have to get plan amendments or go through a plan amendment process for like dredge material disposal that they think is needed, say a year from now, but it's already, you know, a year from now, for example, is like they've missed the boat, for example. Imagine that on
Right.
getting the process started.
Garrett, if I may, I guess I would
Yeah.
counter to say that any new dredge material disposal site requires a plan amendment, right?
That's true. Yeah.
And so it's a question of, do you want to plan ahead with other people who might need it and do a plan
Right.
amendment while we've got the books open? Should we add one or
Right.
two more for you? Or wait until they come to you with a need and go through the process then? And you're right, you know, they might miss the boat on timing.
Right. It's like, are they sure enough of their needs and what they think they'd want to do that they'd think it's worthwhile to do more sooner to set themselves up for the next 5 or 10 years? Or would they want to just wait and be more flexible and do it as needed? And it's kind of up to them. And a plan amendment's required either way. I hear what you're saying. Anybody else want to weigh in here before we touch on cable landings and goal 18? Betsy?
Garrett, I know you and I have talked a little bit about this and somebody just mentioned it a little while ago, but I'm wondering if there's any more discussion or input about the idea of trying to identify places for disposal that might have beneficial uses and help add to resiliency based on what kind of sea level rise impacts, you know, the county is likely to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I mean, the idea of identifying beneficial uses and trying to use that to influence where the Army Corps of Engineers actually disposes is simultaneously like appealing, and there's even, I think, legislation a couple years ago that provided the Corps with something like a mandate and resources to plan more for beneficial use disposal. But it's at the same time, it's hard to, they have a process for identifying their sites. And based on how things have been going, it's hard to imagine trying to crack that with sort of local policies on preferred beneficial use locations. But I don't know. Does anyone have anything else they want to say about using local planning to try to steer beneficial use of dredge material disposal? Gail?
Yeah, I have a question about that, Garrett. So, in terms of how that would be overseen by county staff or enforced or promoted, I'm not sure how that would work, and I would be very concerned about what the capacity of staff would have to be in order to do something like that. We definitely don't have financial resources to take on someone who specializes just in that. And I'm not sure what kind of training we would have to take on ourselves in order to be able to do that successfully.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for discussing this topic. I think it's an important one. Dredge material management plan has been a part of the overall Columbia River estuary plan for a long time, and it's played a role. And you all have helped clarify sort of the usefulness of that role and where we might go going forward. Okay, so want to discuss goal 18 a bit, in particular cable landings, which has been a topic that it sounds like a lot of local residents are interested in, and stakeholders have been interested in it in our past meetings here and outside of the TAC. So again, just wanted to reiterate, cable landings are locations where undersea telecommunications and power cables come ashore and transition to onshore infrastructure. And there's been some cable landings that have been implemented in Oregon, but there's no current proposals for any in Clatsop County. Department of Geology and Mineral Industries did a study in the last several years of the entire Oregon coast, identifying locations where cable landings would be relatively appropriate from like a geological stability standpoint. And they found that much of the Clatsop Plains would actually be relatively ideal for cable landings compared to other parts of Oregon. We've tried to get input from cable landing, a representative of cable landing proponents on their take on like where in Clatsop County this kind of thing might be, where this kind of thing would occur based on their perspective, and haven't gotten a response. So the idea right now is that there's no policies on cable landings in Clatsop County, but there's a variety of concerns around impacts, including pollution, not only in terms of like materials, but like cable and machinery materials, but also drilling fluids being released into the beach and dune environment, the ocean, wetlands that are in the beach and dune environment. There's concerns around other habitat impacts from site preparation where cable landing infrastructure would be sited, construction impacts, impacts to public access and recreation, not only from sort of beach users' experience of the construction process, but also project components like manholes that are left over in the future if erosion occurs. There's been examples of sinkholes that have occurred from beach sand sinking into the cable route underground. Again, drilling fluid releases. There's concerns around vibration affecting nearby residences and other buildings. And so there's a lot of interest in the topic. Some other things that we've heard include that in other examples of cable landings that have been permitted by local governments in Oregon, the reports that are submitted when proponents are getting a permit tend to be overly optimistic about the kinds of risks that they're posing to the beach and dune environment. And an example that was cited for us was that project proponents will make it sound like releases of drilling fluids are relatively rare. And their concern is that they think they're actually relatively normal. And it's like there's usually a release of drilling fluids into the beach and dune environment when a cable landing is being constructed. There's a concern around the potential for project proponents to seek permits for single parts of their project. For example, just like the manhole for their cable landing, but not other parts of the project, and that a local government or Clatsop County wouldn't be able to consider the entire project and all of its potential impacts on goal 17 and 18 resources together at one time. We've heard a lot of concern from y'all about potential miscoordination between local and state permit reviews, including instances in the past and other locations where new information arose during a state permit review that was not that information was not available during the local permit review, and like the local permit wouldn't have been issued if they had known this information that came up later. And again, along the same vein, like after local permits are issued for one part of a project, but not the entire project, a project proponent will make investments in their project that then make it very hard to reverse the location and approach that they're taking. And so again, it's sort of a concern about not taking a comprehensive review of the project. Okay, so some of the policies that we're considering and that you'll have a chance to review, and we've talked about this. We talked about this at the last TAC meeting, but in a little bit less detail. Is that where permitted, cable landings would require a conditional use permit with a geologic hazards report, and that all of the project proponents in the goal 18 and goal 17 area would have to be considered at the same time. And so you wouldn't be allowed to just try to get permits for like one part of the project, but not another. We got input from y'all at the last meeting to consider areas where cable landings should perhaps be prohibited, including in parks and public access sites, residential areas, wetlands and other habitats, and near drinking water well sources, and also near residential areas. And so we reviewed a couple of staff reports from other cable landing permit projects and weren't able to find information that provided like a good basis for a certain distance buffer around some of these resources, like public access sites. Like, we heard you that cable landings should not be permitted in a public park or in a public access site, like adjacent to a parking lot, where large numbers of beach users are accessing the beach. But we didn't find information to inform like a distance from those resources in which cable landings should be prohibited. Same with wetlands, for example. For residential areas, there seemed to be some information suggesting that a 500-foot setback from residential areas is needed to avoid vibration impacts from drilling equipment. And so we're interested in getting some of your input here on whether there's setback or buffer distances aside from those that are, typically found in Oregon local government codes that we should consider. And then in terms of state agency coordination, there's a variety of points that, I think we heard from some of you, including that it would be valuable to require a pre-application conference with all of the state agencies that would be involved ultimately in permitting the cable landing. So that would be required prior to having a complete local permit application. That the geologic hazard report should be scoped with state agency input. And this is something that you find, for example, with scoping traffic impact analyses for projects adjacent to a state highway that, it's common for local governments to have ODOT participate in scoping the traffic impact analysis. So that's sort of the inspiration for this concept. And then just requirements that the local permit process include input from state agencies, and that the project proponent has to essentially follow the recommendations of state agencies that do weigh in on the local permit. So we wanted to get your input on like what other areas of policy are we missing here? Or does it look like we're going down the wrong track in some way or another with these concepts? Kevin? We can't hear you, Kevin.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yes.
All right.
Now we're good.
Yeah, I was thinking on the state agency coordination, adding deals or Dagami to the list. That was
Thank you.
where
Yeah.
some of the additional information came in that even from a high level, it was just raising some red flags that the agencies could have then asked for, and that could have been used to bolster the geohazard report.
Okay.
And I think the other one I know it's not state agency, but also county road departments, was for having DOT, because that was, I think, one of the other big ones that came in on one of the, at least one of the previous was they were using the county right of ways for some of their proposed cable routes, and understanding what those are might help some of the regulatory agencies also understand whether there's approvals and or what the impacts might be.
Okay, that's right. I recall you saying that. What about like impacts to ocean shore users? I mean, I know that's kind of in your all's purview, but can you think of ways of thinking about prohibition areas around heavily used access sites.
Yeah, and that's something we've talked about internally, and I think needs to be part of the broader discussion of, where are these potential landing sites and how do we screen them down? Because I think that is something that has come kind of back to bite us. I mean, the Amazon cable that was the last one we did was, let's say, not as heavily of a beached area as some of the ones in the past have been, but it did coincide with the Oregon Coast Trail and some other user groups. But yeah, I think it's tough to say without knowing, where those proposed sites could be. And and how would you prohibit some areas and not other areas? But I do think it warrants discussion to see if there's a way to proactively look at that. But yeah, I'm not, other than like saying things like, well, downtown Seaside wouldn't be appropriate, or, how do we look at those other areas? And I think you already captured it with some of the main public access points. And because I think we had one of those. Laurel, I'll let you talk a little bit about the experience with that one at a OPRD managed site, kind of where that fits in. But yeah, I think there is validity. I'm just not sure how to get there.
Okay. Jeff wrote something here, but since Kevin, you just referred to Laurel. Laurel, is there anything you'd like to say here?
I mean, I do have experience with that situation in a park environment, but I don't know. There would be no one size fits all lessons learned that I'm like ready
Okay.
to share right now.
Okay. And Jeff wrote in the comments, can we do zoning in the beach and dune environment like we do for goal 16 and 17? Just thinking long term and out of the box conceptually, sure, but there's not really a framework in goal 18 for that like there is in goal 16. There, goal 18 is more oriented around identifying different kinds of beach and dune environments in terms of their stability, and then basing what kinds of uses and activities are allowed in those places based on dune stability. And so that would be a consideration here too. And I think it raises a good point for us, and one that I need to learn even more about these cable landings, in that I'm not sure what project components, if any, commonly like require a location in unstable or conditionally stable dune areas. Like, is there always part of the project where like something like a manhole has to be allowed for them to do it at all? I mean, would guidance need to be established in policy on how that would happen? So I would say that, like, in this update, no, I don't think we're going to do beach and dune, like a unique beach and dune zoning scheme. But we do have this updated data from Dogami on dune stability that would partly also inform where different kinds of uses are allowed and not allowed. Goal 18 basically says that residential, commercial, and industrial uses are not allowed in unstable dune areas or interdunal wetlands, for example. But it doesn't speak to utilities or cable landings.
And Garrett, one
And
thing
yeah,
one thing I'll add to that is we're considering how within our management area we can look at doing some more, I'll call it littoral cell planning. It's maybe not as comprehensive as that, but actually looking at some of those aspects to kind of say, here's what we would not allow, or where there's more protections, less protections, whatever you want to say, for the ocean shore. We currently don't have that in our rules, but have the ability to look at that. So we're considering that, and that could inform a future update. But
Mhm.
yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's probably appropriate to add into this. Because that could be that's going to be a much bigger effort.
Jeff, just noticed that you gave us a link here in the chat, so we'll be sure to take a look at that. You're welcome to elaborate if you'd like, or if anyone else has anything else they'd like to say about this.
Yeah, so when we amended Territorial Sea Plan Part 4, which addresses uses of the seafloor for cables, there was work contracted with a consultant who does a lot of work on undersea cables to write a best practices report. And that's included here in what I just attached. And then there's also from Dogami, a geologic assessment of potential cable landing sites along the Oregon coast. If you haven't looked at it yet, there might be something in there about how suitability is determined that could be helpful. And then it might even identify some places in Clatsop County.
All right, thank you. A few other concepts that were raised in other discussions we have included requiring an inadvertent release contingency plan, which is something that I think is required anyway for other permits, but this is when inadvertent releases when drilling fluids leak from the drilling operation. And there's a variety of procedures that best practices that project proponents can use to minimize the impacts of those when they do occur. And there's even some formal guidance on what should be in inadvertent release contingency plan. There's a fair amount of flexibility in the guidance in terms of what the guidance would say should be required of a proponent. And if you look at the contingency plans that, like I looked at a couple of contingency plans from other projects, and they weren't. I tried to put myself in the shoes of like being a site operator, and like they only had like the contact information for one state agency in the plan in terms of like who you're supposed to call right away, instead of the local government and maybe other state agencies that have an interest in the release. It said to contact the agency within 24 hours. And so there's a variety of, I think, outcomes in terms of how these kinds of things can be implemented. It's an area that, FERC with their guidance went to relatively great detail. They have, it's many pages, this guidance, and it still can be vague in some ways. So this is the kind of thing that it seems like a plan should be required, and the conditional use process is a process that could be used to sort of evaluate that plan and decide whether or not it's good enough, instead of the county issuing dozens of pages of their own on what exactly needs to be inside of it. And so just wanted to circle back on the concept of requiring a conditional use permit for any of these. And on a related note, the idea that the geotechnical report, the geological report, sort of incorporating risk assessments for wetlands, streams, and the aquifer, that should all be sort of addressed through that conditional use permit and the geologic report, sort of in one complete process. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, can speak up now. We're getting close to the end of the meeting and pretty much just wanted to go over some next steps to finish out.
Garrett, I was just gonna mention that that was one of the things with those, with all three plans, the sinkholes, inadvertent and drill breakage. We worked at length with the contractor after the county approval to kind of develop it. Their original proposals were extremely vague, as you mentioned. And so we worked with them to really narrow that down. I'm not going to by any means say they were perfect, but they were a heck of a lot better because it actually put some ownership on them and clearly defined whose role was to contact whom by when, and kind of those types of things, and not just these. Well, we'll let you know at some time after we've already dealt with it. And so there are some those could be used. The Amazon ones could be used as templates to kind of pull out key elements or something of that nature. But I think it goes back to your pre-application agency coordination and having some of those things spelled out very clearly. But yeah, I think having that at least somewhat framed out would be a good start.
Okay. Laurel?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, some of these things could be tied to that interagency coordination if you wanted feedback from the various agencies on things, relative to their expertise, including these plans,
Mhm.
would be really important or helpful, I think, given my experience with the last couple.
Okay. All right.
Because just requiring it doesn't mean that it's going to meet everybody's expectations for what should be in there, as you mentioned. So maybe looping it into that agency review somehow
Right. So
might be helpful.
yeah, so you could see state agencies not only showing up for a pre-app conference, but like providing some guidance at that time, and then also like really digging into the details once an application comes in to provide comments for a planning commission's conditional use permit decision.
If it would be helpful, otherwise there's the potential for there to be different document, if there's a plan that's developed for the county and then they come to OPRD for the ocean shore alteration permit, they also are going to require a plan. So is it the same plan, or are there going to need to be modifications? And then is there any sort of back and forth required? You see where I'm getting at? I don't know if that's clear, but
Yeah.
for the things that are the pipeline is going to span those two jurisdictions or multiple jurisdictions. Will be DSL, parks, county, the pipes connected throughout.
Right.
So I don't know how to solve that problem, but coordination seems like one way to try and improve it.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm curious whether this might set up a situation where there's redundant authorizations, especially if you're in a case where the county receives an application but needs subject matter expertise to know whether it's a good plan or not. Are they going to be reaching out to state agencies to provide that subject matter expertise? In which case you do kind of have a duplication, or might the county bring in third party services that may disagree with the state, and then what do you do? I just wonder what some of the practical aspects would be. But I
Yeah,
don't
it's
know
an
how it
interesting
works in
take on
like
it.
Tillamook, for example, if they've solved this. But
Yeah, because we've gotten a lot of input from the state. At least we've gotten input from parks and DSL. I think DLCD sort of like in this direction of more state involvement up front in providing input and trying to like front load state requirements into the local process so that there's not conflicts. But it also sets up potentially redundant situations, and the state has the right to provide some guidance in the local process, and then there's going to be other requirements for their own state process or their opinion could change between those two times. So there's some chance for conflict in that regard as well. I'm not sure what the right answer is in terms of what to do about that, other than to note that this is based on the direction and feedback we've gotten so far.
So Garrett, I was just going to add one small thing on the considerations because I'm not sure how this fits in, but something that worked really well with the Amazon was they had several kind of public open houses, town halls, whatever you want to call it, early on. And I'm not sure how the county process can facilitate that or encourage it. I just kind of point that out because they did that on their own accord, given all the problems and pushback that happened on some of the previous projects. But I think it was very good to allow the agencies to hear from the public and to some extent hear kind of what their initial thoughts and ideas, and it allowed that conversation to continue to just kind of a constructive way of maybe moving things forward with, but I don't know how you would require it locally or if you have any ability to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen in other contexts, like local government requirements to, for example, before applying or having a complete application, you have to present to the neighborhood association for this kind of a project and submit like the agenda and sign-in sheet from the meeting. It doesn't mean that they have to do it in a meaningful way. I'm trying to think of. I think that might be the kind of thing that could be most usefully communicated just through a pre-application conference, like in an advisory kind of way. And it's ultimately up to them if they want to facilitate that kind of meaningful input and transparency, because it would be very hard for the local government to require it. There's not like checks. It's hard to have like the kinds of, they could just do it in a very superficial way. And then even use it to say like, oh, look, we had this input, even if it wasn't, intentionally not meaningful and not open or transparent, that they complied with the requirement. So I'm not sure what to do with that. It sounds like it was useful in these other situations because the applicant wanted to do it and knew it was a good idea. We'll have to think about how we can encourage that. Okay. So just wanted to follow up on a topic that's come up before that Dogami has shared draft beach and dune morphology data with Clatsop County that it can use to proceed with the Goal 18 update. And it's planning to finish the geomorphology study in 2025. So this is essentially spatial data along with a report that's based on the methods that were used in Tillamook County in 2020 to classify beach and dune areas in terms of their geological characteristics. And this has a sort of a direct linkage to certain Goal 18 requirements in terms of what kinds of uses and activities are allowed in different beach and dune areas based on beach and dune stability. So there's a whole classification scheme that is related to the classifications that are in Goal 18 that is going to stay the same for the Clatsop County study. And this will be used along with the county's ordinance when a project is proposed in the beach and dune area. The county will be able to look at their ordinance that describes, for example, a construction setback line that's established for a subdivision and say, okay, we have this minimum construction setback line that has been established for a long time. Beyond that, we're also going to look at this new geomorphology data that describes beach and dune stability and verify that the most recent data says that a site is stable before proceeding with permitting. And so we just wanted to share that this, we were able to get this data. It's going to allow us to move forward. And similarly, so for this data and really a large number of other goal 16, 17, and 18 resources, we've created a series of maps that are very difficult to share and review in a PowerPoint presentation, but we're going to be sending them out to you in the coming days to invite your input on them. And we will have a chance to talk about them at the next TAC meeting in December, but your input, like outside of the meeting, will also very much be welcome on these maps. And the idea with them is that we need to be able to refer to like a static map when we're adopting the goal 16 and 17 updates. But the idea is that all of the data that's represented in the maps would be available. Already most of it already is available through public viewers on a variety of different web pages. But that the county could also sort of make them available in their existing map viewer or in perhaps another one that's dedicated to goal 16, 17, and 18. So I just wanted to give you a preview that we're going to be sending you maps to review along with some draft policies for all three of the goals. And we're looking forward to our next discussion and getting your input on all of that. So we're a little bit past our meeting end time and the end of the workday. So thanks for sticking with us. And we really appreciate your participation in the county's process. Look forward to seeing you in December at TAC meeting number 4. And if you want to attend public meetings, those will also be in December. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, Garrett. Thanks for the presentation. Yeah, as a reminder, the public meeting, if any constituent is interested, we're having a public meeting here in Astoria on December 7th. That's a Saturday from 10 to noon. You're welcome to attend, and you can welcome to advertise it to anybody who might want to attend. And then keep an eye out for the next TAC meeting scheduler.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yeah. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks.